Hello, this is my lecture on international trade of food and land-based products. This is me, and you can find my email down there, so just drop me an email if you have any question regarding the content of this lecture. And here is where I get my funding from. So, regarding today's subject on international trade of food and biomass, we will start discussing some of the non-academic narratives that are being discussed out there. Then we will look at a little bit at the academic narratives, some of the stories that are discussed within the academic literature. I will briefly go through some of the data that you can find if you want to work yourself on such matter, or some of the methods that you can apply to overcome some of the data challenges. And finally, we will discuss a little bit about actors in governance regarding the system of international trade of food and biomass. So let's start with watching a video just of a brief introduction. Is kind of basic stuff on deforestation, just to know what is the issue that we are actually discussing.
Forests cover about 30% of the planet, and the ecosystems they create play an essential role in supporting life on Earth. But deforestation is clearing Earth's forests on a massive scale, and at the current rate of destruction, the world's rainforests could completely disappear within 100 years. Why should we care about deforestation? Together, forestry and agriculture are responsible for 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, making deforestation a significant contributor to climate change. Deforestation impacts the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in two ways. First, when trees are felled, they release the carbon they are storing into the atmosphere. Second, trees play a critical role in absorbing the greenhouse gases that fuel global warming. Fewer forests mean larger amounts of greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere, and increased speed and severity of global warming. In addition to helping regulate the Earth's climate, forests provide habitats for over 80% of the plants and animals that live on land. But deforestation destroys these habitats, diminishing biodiversity. Some estimate that 4,000 to 6,000 rainforest species go extinct each year. This also affects the more than 2 billion people who rely on forests as sources of food and shelter. The biggest driver of deforestation is agriculture. Farmers chop down trees in order to plant crops like soybeans, palm trees, and cocoa, or to make room to raise livestock for beef. Logging operations, which provide the world's wood and paper products, also cut countless trees each year. Forests are also destroyed as a result of growing urban sprawl as land is developed for dwellings. The effects of deforestation are grave, but not irreversible. Efforts such as managing forest resources, eliminating clear-cutting, and planting new trees to replace those removed are already being made to reduce deforestation's environmental impact on our planet. And while some plant and animal species are gone forever, combating deforestation can help prevent further loss of biodiversity.
Alright, so much about the main issue that we will discuss today, which is deforestation. I just want to say that we don't only care about forests, but as well other ecosystems like savannas and grasslands are sometimes equally important, and we should keep that in mind. A little bit on background now, more from a scientific perspective. Most of the deforestation, so the forest loss, can be attributed to commodity-driven deforestation, so commodity production, so agricultural commodities or forestry commodities, and wood and logging, as has been explained in the video. Here you can see that in sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, it's rather deforestation led by shifting agriculture, as it may be in eastern Brazil or more Central American countries. Meanwhile, the value of internationally traded agricultural commodities has been multiplied by 40 since 1961. So, here comes a question where how these two effects, so all this deforestation or loss of natural vegetation, natural ecosystems, and this increase in international trade are linked to each other. Maybe take a minute yourself if you want. Um, think of how you feel about this and what kind of stories, what kind of products you are thinking of. Maybe it could be some actors that you think are often linked to that, maybe some NGO campaigning slogans. Think of some of those narratives, of those stories that you may have heard linked to this subject of how international trade and deforestation, degradation of ecosystems are linked to each other. So, a little bit more on the background here. Um, in terms of calories, actually, international trade is mostly linked to wheat, soybean, maize, rice, while in terms of value, this is the share of internationally traded products in terms of monetary value is much more um, leaning to meat and animal products, followed by fruits, vegetables, or nuts, and stimulant products, so coffee, tea, cocoa, spices. This is important to keep in mind because some of the studies you might read out there might either rely on biophysical data or on monetary data, and this may indeed shift the the focus of the story towards either those very heavy or calorie intense products or to those rather expensive products. In terms of embodied land, so we sometimes I think we will mostly in this lecture discuss three types of land. So cropland, the land where you grow the crops, the cereals, or any kind of crops, fruit, vegetables. It's as well permanent crops as palms and cocoa. This is all counts as cropland. Then there's grassland where the animals are grazing, which can be permanent pastures or meadows. Or the third one will be forest land, where we extract all the wood and forestry products. So here in these maps, you see how much cropland, the first category we talked about, is needed to produce the commodities that are traded internationally and from which country to which country they are transported. What we observe is that in the late 80s, the major exporting countries were the USA, South American countries, and Australia. It was mostly exclusively these countries leading the export market of crop products and embodied cropland, indeed. While then tropical countries from South America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa became more prominent then in the 2000s. Um, you may see in the second map down here that actually nowadays, I mean at least at this time, it's still going on. South America, lots of exports were coming from South America, from Sub-Saharan Africa, more at least than before, and now Southeast Asia becoming one as well of the major players in the export market. The Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, this region used to be a large importer of crops, mostly cereals, from North America as a support for food during the Soviet times, while it turned after the fall of the Soviet Union into a large exporting country, and I'm not talking only about Russia, but including as well Kazakhstan or the Ukraine, which are providing a lot of cereals um, for Western Europe or the Middle East. At the same time, the former Soviet Union countries are importing quite a bit of meat from South America. Finally, China has become the largest importer of cropland, and as you can see, with imports from North and South America, from Australia, from Southeast Asia, from South Asia as well, while the EU kept being still one of the biggest importer. And most of those, more and more of those imports are now coming from the tropical regions, as I said before. Agricultural exports flow mostly from sparsely populated to densely populated areas. This is the main explanatory variable when you try to explain where agricultural exports are exported from and imported by. So as well, it seems that there's more exchange of agricultural products between rich countries, to a lesser extent between some of the emerging developing countries and the rich countries, although the least developed countries are usually not really integrated in this global trade system. And the issue on whether there is an unequal ecological exchange of land between southern and northern or developing and developed countries is a little bit contested. Finally, South-South connections are as well increasing, both in terms of trade, but as well in terms of exchange of information or investment. Let's dig a little bit now into different narratives that different actors have on this subject of international trade of land-based products. First, we will look at an interview from a worker at the World Trade Organization, then a video from an NGO, Fern, and then we will dig a little bit into what the scientific community says about the subject, following a little bit what is written in the IPCC about trade and the environment, and mostly deforestation or degradation of land ecosystems. Let's first watch this first interview.
The debate on trade and the environment has become a very constructive part of the WTO system. 25 years ago, one was careful not even to mention the word environment in this building. But nowadays, it's recognized that trade, sustainable development linkage is an important part of the WTO. And in the environment regime, UNEP and the multilateral environmental agreements also recognize that their connections with trade are very important. The WTO does a lot more on the environment, and I think the public understanding of the importance of the WTO and the fact that it's not a threat to the environment also helps improve public acceptance of the WTO and support for the trading system and trade liberalization. You have to make sure that the environment side gets a fair hearing in the WTO dispute settlement system, to make sure that environmental expertise is given to the panels, that the panels include people who have some experience in the environment. And so far, that's what's happened in the key environmental cases that we've had. I think it's also important at the national level that trade and environment officials of each country work together. And that's been one of the byproducts of this debate over the past 25 years, that in the WTO, in the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, we have found that at the national level, policymakers weren't linking these issues very well, but because there was an international debate and governments had to prepare a position for the international organizations, that we had much more cooperation and coordination between the ministries in environment, development, trade, commerce, even labor, than there had been in previous times.
All right, enough for this interview. So what are the main points that this worker of the WTO is mentioning? So he says that he recognizes environment and trade as being interlinked issues. He is mentioning that the work of integrating trade into, not the other way around, the environment into trade negotiation is fostering multilateral collaboration, either across organizations as between the UNEP and the WTO, or across countries, or even across ministries within each country. He is making a big claim there that the WTO and trade liberalization as itself are not a threat to the environment. He is mentioning the WTO dispute settlement system, that so sort of a way of these trade bodies to govern environmental issues. And he is explaining how this putting this subject of trade and the environment at the international level puts pressure on national policies and structures to link this subject as well at the national level. Now let's have a look at a campaigning video or lobbying video from them.
When the European Union negotiated controversial trade deals with Canada and the US, people took to the streets in protest at the threats they posed to their rights. But did you know that Europe is currently negotiating similar trade deals with highly forested countries? These deals have attracted less attention, but their impact could be just as grave. Despite its commitments to stop deforestation, the EU still imports wood, soy, palm oil, beef, cocoa and leather, which are often grown on illegally deforested land in the tropics. 1 football field of tropical forest is illegally felled every 2 minutes to supply the EU. This has terrible consequences for human rights and our climate. Free trade deals can make the situation worse. To stop this from happening, the European Union must assess the potential impacts of each agreement on human rights and the environment, make sure the NGOs and forest communities who best understand the local situation are at the negotiation table, and that their concerns are met with just solutions. Ensure all agreements support the rights of forest communities and include provisions to support the implementation of the voluntary guidelines on land tenure, the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Finally, civil society must agree and play a monitoring role, and complaints they raise must result in follow-up action. Please, share this video to raise awareness on how to ensure that trade agreements avoid damaging forests and people's rights.
Alright, so we have here contrasting view. I lost my slide. We have here to some extent contrasting view on this subject. What does this NGO say about trade and the environment? Well, first that there's some civil concerns about it, that impacts could be just as grave. They are linked to import deforestation, issues in human rights, or threats to the climate and biodiversity. They mention that commitments might not be achieved. Um, they as well make a statement that free trade deals can make the situation worse, which is in contrast to what we've seen in the first interview from the WTO. They mention possible improvements, so they're not entirely against trade deals. While it would be possible to improve those deals by assessing the potential impacts on the environment and on human rights, by having inclusive processes where NGOs and forest communities have a right to say, and by finding just solutions that would provide benefits to those different actors and not only those involved in the close negotiations. It mentions that there has to be closures on respecting human rights or land tenure, on climate and on biodiversity, and that then needs to be monitoring processes where complaints from civil society actually need to follow up actions. And finally, let's now dig a little bit into what scientific communities are discussing about this subject on trade, environment, and land use. I made an exercise of actually going through different IPCC reports, so the assessment reports number 5, then the special report on 1.5 degrees, and the special report on land and climate change. There's no specific chapter on trade and the environment in any of those reports, so that's why I had to gather different sentences where trade is mentioned in order to get an overview of what is actually in the IPCC discussed when it comes to trade. And you will see that I will compare some of those claims in the IPCC to other sources are found in the literature. So the probably most prominent mention time trade is mentioned is in the very important document, which is the summary for policymakers from the assessment report. And here it just says international dimensions such as trade are important for understanding the risks of climate change at regional scales. So it's not very informative in terms of content. It's more just underlying the importance, and as well that it as well shows differences between the regions, not only the global total. So, for example, one of the papers a paper that just came out a few weeks ago showed that the deforestation footprint per capita of different countries were quite different and differed in whether they were domestic or non-domestic. Some of the facts we see from this figure: first, that countries that have a lot of forests, I mean by forest rich here, I don't mean in terms of GDP, I mean in terms of countries that just have a lot of forest cover, have first high deforestation footprint. So actually probably the largest part of the total deforestation is for consumption in those countries that have forests themselves and that are deforesting themselves, because that deforestation is mostly consumed domestically. Here you see the blue areas for deforestation in Canada, in Sweden, in Brazil, and Norway, which kind of half and half domestic and imported. The US, Australia, Russia, Indonesia, they are all quite associated to large forest footprint due to domestic consumption. So we should not as well overclaim that every deforestation is linked to trade. However, for some regions, trade is the largest matter when it comes to consume deforestation or to the forest footprint, deforestation footprint. Mostly in the EU, in Western Europe, you see here France and Germany or the UK, Italy being still among the largest importers, and putting them together as a European Union, you will see very large deforestation footprint, which is mostly non-domestic, so due to imports, as well as some of the developed Eastern Asian countries, or Singapore, or Japan, and South Korea, as well, importing a lot of footprint on forest deforestation. Bear in mind that these are all in per capita values. So China, although being the largest importer of deforestation today, in terms of per capita value, is still a rather small player. We have different types of countries according to this paper. They classify first China and India as being very much reforesting countries. And there's a lot of afforestation programs that have been going on in China and India, although these efforts have till 2015 been turning downwards, and still China and India are importing a lot of deforestation, especially so here this data is from 2001 when China entered the WTO, and this leads to a situation that now when you correct for re-imports, the benefits from reforestation domestically are offset to some extent. G7 countries is a quite interesting case because they are reforesting domestically. The dotted line represents the domestic forest cover. Although when correcting for imports, the G7 countries are actually causing deforestation around the world. So they get into this negative area. All the countries, including the tropical Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico countries, and non-G20 countries, or both at the production and the consumption level deforesting countries, although a large share, not the entire share, I mean not even the largest share, but some share is due to exports. So when correcting for these exports, you see a much smaller responsibility for deforestation at the consumption level. While deforestation area is not the only indicator we should look at, a previous paper had been looking at carbon sequestration, carbon sequestration and biodiversity threats linked to international trade, and this sometimes shows slightly different patterns when you actually look at different indicators linked to international trade. Mostly when you look in terms of carbon, well, we have the three biggest suspects. So Asian countries, and mostly Southeast Asian countries. Very first, Central and South America being the largest exporting regions of foregone carbon sequestration, and African countries exporting to Western Europe, Asian countries, China, and Japan, and as we said before. While in terms of biodiversity, we see some other players. For example, actually Eastern Europe or North America, where there might be less dense and productive forests, or with less carbon, but still some important species and biodiversity living there. So those exports from Eastern Europe and North America may be as well linked to biodiversity threats. All right, let's dig a little bit more into some of the subjects that you can find in the different chapters of the IPCC reports. One of the most prominent mentions to trade and the environment, in this case for deforestation, is the idea of reallocation of production and emissions for mitigation. Let me explain you with a little example what this actually means. This is an example, I specify this, so this could be any countries. It's just to illustrate the thoughts. If you have one country producing a lot of beef, for example, but in this country, beef production is associated to a lot of deforestation, vegetation destruction, and CO2 emissions, while in the other country, I'm not saying it's absolutely the case, I'm just taking this example, beef production would be more environmentally friendly, for example. The idea of reallocating globally to mitigate climate change would be to, instead of producing in the first country, producing in the second country and exporting these goods either back to the former country or to any other country which wants to consume them, and in that way decreasing CO2 emissions, pressure on forests and ecosystems. In the literature on land, we find some support or discussion about this. For example, in this paper from Kastner and colleagues 2014, there's the idea that if in the year 2000 there had been no trade at all, we would have needed more, another 8% of cropland to produce the entire crops that we need on Earth. Although they say that compared to closing yield gaps, this is very little achievement. And here's some of my work that actually fits to this debate on can we reduce pressure on ecosystems by reallocating production globally and trading. So I look backwards over a time series and use a different indicator, so not only land surface, but actually the human appropriation of net primary production. Let me explain you this indicator, which has some other strengths and as well some drawbacks. So plants take the energy from the sun and grow through the process called net primary production, or NPP. This is the big pool of energy which is available for all species, then of all heterotroph species, through the trophic chains. And the only thing is there's another player in this game, and that's us. We want as well some of that energy needed for food and for shelter. This share that we get out of this pool of energy or of biomass, however you account for it, is called the human appropriation of net primary production, or hemp. The idea behind this indicator is if this hemp increases, well, we leave less energy for those other species, and as a consequence, it is likely that several of them would go extinct. This is called the energy availability hypothesis. Well, there's some other links to the hemp, because by doing this, we most likely reduce the carbon intake of vegetation, although this depends on other properties of ecosystems. We may affect the water cycle through the evapotranspiration of plants, or there's some evidence that we might affect soil erosion and other ecosystem functions linked to vegetation. So I looked at the effect of reallocation of agricultural production due to international trade over the period 1986 to 2011. My findings were that in the 1990s, this effect of reallocating the production through international trade did indeed reduce the HAMP, the sort of pressure on ecosystems, but increased it afterwards quite drastically. At the end, the global allocation was less optimal than at the beginning of the period. But looking a little bit deeper into it, trade within the regions that we define, so world regions, mostly continental regions, seem to be quite beneficial by reducing pressure on ecosystems measured with HAMP. So it could be like trade between Southern European countries, Mediterranean countries, and Northern European countries. On the other hand, a trade across the regions from 1995 onwards was actually putting quite some additional pressure on ecosystems. Well, if you look a little bit at the history of trade agreements, you may see a pattern, although I have to analyze the causality between them. But in the beginning of the 90s, there was a time where continental free trade agreement became very prominent, with the agreement of Mercosur in 1991, the European free trade, single market in 1992, North American free trade agreement in 1994. While since the late 90s, there's been a trend to liberalize trade globally, with the biggest step being the Agreement on Agriculture from the Uruguay GATT round in 1995, leading as well to the creation of the WTO and the entrance of China into the WTO in 2001, leading to a large specialization of China, being specializing into a manufacturing country and importing more of its biomass and agricultural products. And from the 2000s, there's been the rise of large bilateral trade agreements, cross-continental. Just one example, for example, between the EU and Chile. And just to mention it, the Chile is one of the main sources for fruits and vegetables consumed in Europe. So now linking this to our data, we see that indeed since 1995 there's been this massive increase of exports from South America to the major importing regions, to China, Eastern Asia. Exports to Europe were already big, to former Soviet countries, to the Middle East as well, this pink area. Same pattern here for exports from Southeast Asia, suddenly rising since from the late 90s, again to Eastern Asia, to Western Europe, and to India, actually India being the largest importer of palm oil from Indonesia. Alright, so much about the reallocation of production for mitigation. The next debate is about the spatial disconnect, or some often called telecouplings. The idea behind that is taking again the same example of an exporting country and an importing country. And if, for example, something happened because of this flow, something happened in the importing country, let's say a shift in consumer preferences, then this will likely affect the foreign country, because these two are linked through international trade flows. So here's a paper of one of my colleagues who illustrated this idea by looking at different diets from the USA and how changes in these diets are affecting land use all around the world, and not just generally speaking around the world, but in each specific country. And just to illustrate a finding, we see that if one American stops eating meat, the yearly grassland use in Australia will be reduced by 236 square meters. Looking further to another subject discussed in the IPCC is that trade liberalization may have economic effects on demand and supplies, for example, through lower prices. Same example here. Imagine that between this country and this country, there are originally high trade costs. When you remove these trade costs, it is likely to affect consumer behaviors or producer behaviors, and that this will change the way we produce and trade. In this modeling exercise from Verberg and colleagues already more than a decade ago, they actually found out that removing all trade barriers of agricultural products all over the world would lead to a massive increase of cattle production in South America and Brazil especially, leading to large increases in greenhouse gas emissions in the short run. I mean, for them 2015 was at 2009 the short run. Although they they say that in the long run this will be mitigated by the fact that they assume in their model that all spared area in the importing countries, so in that case it would be North America and Europe, these areas will be used for reforestation or regrowth of natural vegetation, storing important amounts of of carbon. They do say as well, although, that there's a high time lag between these additional emissions in the short run and the storage in the long run, which may lead to overshooting the climate targets and overpassing some of the tipping points, for example. Now, another mention to trade of food in the IPCC report is trade to avoid hunger under strict mitigation measures. So, just to illustrate what this means is that if a producing country now tries to make a lot of greenhouse gas mitigation measures, that as a consequence production along the emissions would be reduced, then trade could avoid hunger situations in that country. I didn't bring any paper on that. It's not my field. Now, looking at the second large family of themes that are mentioned in the IPCC reports is how trade is linked to climate change adaptation, with the most prominent one the idea that due to climate change some regions will be positively affected and others might be negatively affected to produce food. So here, if you, as a consequence of climate change, or first region becomes positively affected, the climate becomes nicer, there's maybe good water conditions to grow crops, while in the other region, I'm not saying that's true, I'm just saying, taking this as an example, water conditions might be less prominent to grow. In this case, I drew some crops, cereals. Then production will decrease in the second region and increase in the former. And as a consequence, it would be nice to, as an adaptation measure, being able to trade these changes in production across continents. Some authors that have recently, 2 years ago, looked into how climate change would affect global water availability and how countries would optimally adapt to this new water stress induced by climate change and how this would affect trade under different types of water regulation. What we observe here is that due to climate change and induced water stress, it would be optimal to increase exports from Latin American countries in from Southeast Asia or from Oceania, especially if, as an adaptation measure to climate change, we put high regulation on water usage, then this effect of higher exports from South America and Southeast Asia would be highest. Summarizing, I say that actually bilateral trade needs to increase by 5% in order to compensate for water stress induced by climate change. And they do point to some trade-offs between adapting to climate change by optimally using water around the world and inducing potentially more tropical deforestation. Another point raised in the context of climate change adaptation and international trade is to provide market stability and resilience against punctual weather extremes. So if due to climate change there's storms, flood or drought in a given producing country, then production would be reduced in that country, and it would be nice to have a flexible international trade system in order to suddenly punctually just being able to provide sufficient food to these countries who are affected punctually by climate change. Didn't bring any paper about that. There's probably some out there, but it's out of the scope of this lecture. And but they say that there's a but, because at the same time this could increase vulnerability through depending on global markets, which may lead to export bans, for example, following weather extremes or any pandemic situation, for example. So if the entire world depends on just a few exporting regions, then if due to climate change there's punctually a weather extreme in that region, that may lead to closing the borders of the exports and having nationally first policies and lead to food shortages in other regions. I'm not saying this would be Europe, it's just an illustrative example. And again, I didn't bring any paper for that. And the third family of discourse of discussion in the IPCC reports is how trade agreements and trade organizations are a way to govern emissions due to forestry and land use change. So this would be the idea that if there's a trade flow between one country and another, and these countries make a trade agreement, this would be the opportunity, for example, for one of the regions to say we only make this trade agreement if you reduce your deforestation and your CO2 emissions. A recent discussion on this has been about the EU and Mercosur agreement, and here a paper from last year discussing how this trade agreement is maybe a lost chance to do this, because just by the fact of the agreement itself first being an agreement to increase the quota from on beef from 200,000 to almost by half, another 99,000, or by having 50,000 tons of ethanol each year imported by the EU from South America, increasing this by a new quota of 650,000 tons. Knowing that we already in the European Union import a football pitch of deforestation every 3 minutes from Mercosur regions. Look at now of the sustainability of not only the tariff measures themselves, but as well the entire process. The scientists, the authors, just make the claim that the negotiations were not inclusive, mostly that indigenous communities did not have sufficient opportunities to be part of the negotiations, as well that the agreement does not force transparency. So this would have been the opportunity, for example, to make mandatory firms who want to export from South America to Europe to display all their trade flows, to be able to trace back where they source their agricultural products from and where they're selling them to. And finally, there's little way to enforce the sustainability measures. There's no way to, as was in the first video from Fan, to actually have follow-up actions if you discern some sustainability or human rights issues linked to the trade between the two parties. Well, even outside the IPCC, there's as well a bunch of other debates going on that are linking international trade to the environment, more specifically deforestation, land use, degradation of ecosystems on land. These may be due to how trade increases economic growth. As a consequence, some would say it's good, others would say it's bad. How trade induces specialization. I told you about China becoming specialized because of international trade, became specialized into manufacture and started importing all agricultural products. There's a discussion going on about how trade favorizes exchanges in knowledge and technologies across countries, more and more across southern countries. There's as well great literature on how trade introduces invasive species and how this affects ecosystems. How trade opens the nutrient cycles by having feed producing countries that export to animal product producing countries, and that you need a lot of nitrogen fertilizers to put on the feed crops fields, and on the other hand, you don't know what to do with the animal dung that is now laying around and no crop field to display it on, just jeopardizing the entire nutrient cycle. There's some debate, as I told before, about unequal ecological exchange, about biomass products, etc., etc. So just summarizing a little bit on the non-academic and academic narratives. I'm not going through all the points I said again, but I think we can say that trade is still a quite contested subject. That its importance is large, and most of all getting bigger, but let's not overstated because a large share is still domestic. The largest share of the pressure on forests and ecosystems is still due to domestic consumption, but the importance of trade is rising as we talk. Some people see it as a threat, others as a solution. Some see it neither as a threat nor a solution. The potential effects, processes through which trade affects land use and the environment are complex and multiple, as we've seen. But if there's one thing I want to make sure through the points I showed you, is that it is very unlikely that the benefits, if benefits are at all, in terms of mitigation, adaptation, or governance of climate and other environmental issues, are very unlikely, or rather probably not automatic side effects of just liberalizing trade, but just they could be achieved if and only if the sustainability targets are the main target of trade regulations. All right, so before we change the subject, I don't know if you maybe have just reached enlightenment, or if you feel rather like this, but this may be just a moment to take a break, and I will move on straight to the next slide. So here I will briefly discuss some of the data that is used in this sort of literature. There's as well others, but I just want to mention that. We usually, my colleagues and I usually rely on FAO stat data. It's in monetary terms and in physical terms. So you can take the one that best fits the research question at hand. You can look at both gross imports and exports by products categories, or either by end use, which you will find in the commodity balances. And the one I'm using most are the detailed or bilateral trade matrices, which really explains for each product the trade between country A and country B. The main challenge behind the main challenge we encounter when looking at this data is the fact that some countries re-export actually commodities. So take a country like Brazil. Imagine they export to the Netherlands. I mean, this is actually the case. But the Netherlands is just serving as a port to other European countries. So that what you would see in the reported data is a flow from Brazil to the Netherlands and flows from the Netherlands to European countries. But what you often want, not always, but often, is actually to know the flow from Brazil, the originally producing country, to the end consuming country. And there's various ways to do that. First, here's an example on soy consumed in Austria. When you only look at the reported data, then you see you would actually think that most of the soy comes from Italy, from Germany, from the Netherlands, the UK. Well, after correcting for re-exports, you actually find out that this soy obviously does not come from the Netherlands, but from South America, Brazil, Argentina, or the USA. This relies obviously on some assumptions of the mix of exports and re-exports. So the approaches to do that is the one I'm using most first, called the physical trade matrices, which relies on biophysical data. So it is actually the products themselves that you can measure. It has a very fine product resolution with around a few hundred products. The other drawback, however, it does not include trade flows of industrial products or textile. So if biomass is used in for industrial purposes, this would not be shown by this kind of data. Another family are the multi-regional input-output methods. There are various databases out there as Exabase, ERA, GTAB, or WIOD. It's mostly monetary accounting, which relies then on the assumption of a homogeneous price within each product category, which is a contested assumption. So, for example, for wheat, you would have the same price for a kilogram of bread or a kilogram of raw wheat, and then it will make no difference if you trade bread or if you trade wheat. It has as well often a limited product resolution, so sometimes there's just one or a few agricultural products, in this case called sectors. But the good thing is that it includes as well the links between the agricultural sectors and the industrial sectors. So if biomass is used to make textiles and other industrial goods, this would actually be accounted in. There's now a new model that has come out, which is a biophysical multi-regional input-output table. It's called Fabio, developed by Martin Bruckner, and which is probably solving quite of those limitations I've said before. There's rather some large agreement across these different methods, around 80% most of the time, except for some representative countries. So, for example, for China, their first family of studies would see China as an importing country of biomass and land products, while this family, the MRIO family, sees China as a large exporter of land. Finally, the emerging tool that is now more and more used, it's becoming really popular, so you should really check it out yourself. It's trace.earth. It's a very comprehensive and wonderful database. It does not cover all products, it's just for some very specific and representative products as soy and palm oil, cocoa, and so on. The strength of that tool is that it is first at the subnational level, so you could see the impact of those trade flows, not only, for example, saying from Brazil or any country, but actually the going up to the municipal level. And the other major improvement of that tool is that you can see actually which companies are linked to these trade flows, because we should never forget what looks just like an arrow on a map is actually a bunch of people and companies influencing that trade flow. So here I'll draw you an exercise. You can do it yourself to find the 4 top exporting companies associated to CO2 emissions risk linked to deforestation from soy production in Brazil in 2018. A second one, you can look at which biome was linked to most CO2 emissions risk from deforestation in Brazil in 2018. So I recommend doing it yourself. It's really nice to get your hands on that tool. For example, it's getting really influential. The last report that just came out from the WWF last week on imported deforestation from the EU is based on this tool. So it's really something that one should get aware of. So if you're fine with it, you can stop it if you want to do the exercise yourself, and I will now get straight to the solution. So top 4 exporting companies say CO2 emissions in Brazil for soy production were Amagi, Bongi, Cargill, and ADM. There's another big player in this market, which is Louis Dreyfus, but it seems that actually there's much less deforestation and CO2 emissions linked to the supply chain per product than for the other companies. I mean, it's really nice to have a tool to actually know those names. Really, it's we are now able to um, to show the power that these companies have, and soon and hopefully maybe it might be possible to sue some of them for not taking action. And this is a really important thing, to have this power of just knowing the different impact of different companies. All right, which biome was linked to most CO2 emissions? I didn't write it, but I meant in Brazil and for soy production. And it's mostly the Cerrado, which is a savanna. Savanna, so not quite a tropical rainforest, as most people think of when they think of deforestation in Brazil. Why is it so? It's because the Amazon is mostly protected by the soy moratorium since 2006, where large companies said they would not source anymore the soy from Amazon regions. On the other hand, from deforested Amazon regions, this has led to actually changing the pattern of deforestation in the Amazon, which is now mostly for cattle ranching. And after sufficient years, it's now possible again to produce soy on this formerly cattle-grazed land that is now not considered anymore as deforested for soy, but it was originally deforested for cattle, and it's now fine again to produce soy on it after sufficient years. Now the effect is that soy production has been pushed away through the Cerrado or through other countries outside Brazil. Still, we should as well point to the great achievements of the soy moratorium, who has actually, despite those limitations, made a good job at reducing deforestation, along with other measures taken in Brazil at that time to reduce deforestation in that country. Alright, here we go straight to the last part of this lecture, which is about governing imported deforestation and ecosystem degradation. In a policy brief, Trace, the people making this database I told you before, showed, based on another paper from Florence Pendrell, that out of the 203,000 hectares of imported deforestation from the European Union, the majority was for palm oil imports from Indonesia, followed by soybeans, wood products, Brazil or Chile as well. So it's including as well paper pulp, for example, coffee, beef, maize, cocoa, rubber, etc., etc. A colleague of mine wrote a piece listing 86 policy options that had been suggested in the EU's public consultation, and they've been then classified into policies regarding information, spreading information on the issue of imported deforestation in the EU, including awareness and transparency of the supply chains, labels to inform the consumers, for example, to what sort of product or to what impact the product are associated or not associated. If you want, there's a link in here. You can read a report as well from Greenpeace lately on the effect of labels on deforestation and its limitations. They are The second family of options is on collaboration and partnership agreements. Here is as well a great report by Fan on how partnership agreements like the soil moratorium that I told you before, which was a partnership between government institutions and major companies to tackle deforestation in the Amazonas, how these partnership agreements should be framed to keep the benefits while limiting the spillovers I've been listing before. There are some market-based options, including the REDD Plus, so the payment of certain countries to make reforestation projects in other countries. It could be tariffs on certain products that lead to deforestation or not respecting human rights, and regulatory measures, so including mandatory due diligence, very much discussed Thursday in the upcoming law from the European Union, mandatory transparency, mandatory standards. You may want to as well have a look at this report from the European Union Parliament, stating its recommendations to the Commission. But a point that is if that we should be aware of when thinking of regulating supply chains and governing the issue of imported deforestation is that all supply chains have this structure of a bottleneck. There's this bottleneck in the middle, having a lot of producers upstream, a lot of consumers downstream, and usually this handful of 5 companies in the middle. If you take the example of palm oil, 73% of all deforestation risks linked to export is linked to just 5 trading companies. This again comes from the trade database. So it's really, those companies are both have a real responsibility, and it's a great opportunity. If we want to rapidly make achievements, we need to both have them on the table and regulate them very strictly, because we have now had 1 to 2 decades of voluntary measures to eliminate deforestation from the supply chains. In 2010, 400 companies committed to voluntarily eliminate deforestation from their supply chain. There's been some improvement, but still just little complete achievements. Here is some literature you can read by clicking on this link. And we need now to move from the voluntary to the mandatory measures, which is at the heart of the currently ongoing debate on the EU legislation that will be that is on the negotiation table, which is about implementing mandatory due diligence. Due diligence is a tool. It's a measure so that all companies would be mandated. They would have to be aware of their entire supply chain and make the most possible So they would have to show that they did their best to actually eliminate deforestation and human rights problems all along the supply chain. This should as well include the financial sector as well, including their investments uh, for banks and financial institutions investing in companies that are linked to deforestation or ecosystem degradation. And there will very likely be a law because everybody supports the law, even the industry itself. But the real debate relies on the details, and the success of this law will be very much linked to whether now we manage to push for a very strong law, mm, including some punishment measures for companies that are not able to show that they, for example, knew about an issue and did not take sufficient measures to eliminate the deforestation from their supply chain, that there will be some follow-up actions, including that these companies would not be able anymore to to take away the products or the allowance to actually sell products on the European market, and in extreme cases, even some maybe punishments at the individual level for really persons that knew about it and didn't do anything. Um, here is a Greenpeace report which I found actually um, quite good in explaining the whole deal about this due diligence law and how a strong law would actually make a good difference. And here you can follow the other links to see some of the debates going on about this law and with both policymakers and people from industry and NGOs, civil society, discussing the pros and cons of the law. Right, so um, I will put all my sources then later on there in a link. And I thank you very much for listening. Hope that this was insightful.